The Wield Foundation is a charitable trust that was established in 2003. Its primary objective is to preserve and restore historically significant military vehicles and equipment.
The Wield Foundation is made up of three separate parts. Firstly, the German collection, of which we are largely complete now, and the majority of that focus was on reconnaissance vehicles. We've subsequently moved on, when we had the opportunity, to the First World War, and the vehicles representing that collection are the Renault FT and the Renault TSF, both assembled and used in the First World War. The third part of the collection is actually the Empire collection. The Empire collection started here a few years ago, recognizing the contribution of the Commonwealth, or the old Empire, to Britain's war effort during the Second World War. We had a discussion to try and work out which vehicles and what, let's say, type of vehicle would be very good representatives for this. What we decided to focus in on were countries like, for example, South Africa and its war effort, and the very same for Australia. That would be the local Pattern 1, which was their first attempt at obviously creating a Vickers machine gun carrier. And then we intend to cover India's war effort, India's designing, developing and assembling their own Indian pattern carrier. And with India, we have a very, let's say, fortunate offshoot in that we are looking at a New Zealand assembled Indian pattern carrier. There is no real representation or acknowledgement here in the Northern Hemisphere as to what these countries actually did. And if you look at the Indian pattern carrier itself, there were 4,600 and so of these vehicles produced during the Second World War, which were all used in North Africa in 1941-42. Thereafter, they were used in places such as Southern Europe, which would be Italy and the Balkans, and then also used against the Japanese in South Asia. So that's a very big footprint of Indian industry into the Second World War. Good afternoon, Hilary. This is going to be very good to talk about the Indian pattern carrier assembled in New Zealand. Okay, so what's your take on why we embarked upon the Empire collection itself?
The first big thing is most of the background has been forgotten.
Yep.
And essentially at Dunkirk in 1940, the Allies were defeated. They lost a huge percentage of their equipment. I mean, the only thing that prevented Britain being overrun was that there was a channel in between Britain and France. Otherwise, Germany would have walked in and it would have been all over. The situation was desperate. The colonies could not be supplied with equipment, so they embarked on a series of panic measures to introduce their own production and facilities. In the case of India, they decided on the wheeled carrier. In New Zealand, they were left swinging high and dry because they had made a plan to start assembly of Bren gun carriers, but they now couldn't get any armour plate from Britain to make those. So they were looking around at what else they could do, and they depended in one hand on Australia, and they considered getting involved with the Indian production also. It's a very interesting period of startup for each of these countries. And it's amazing what they produced.
Why did India actually develop a wheeled carrier? Why were they not actually doing, for example, what other nations such as the Australians were doing in building a tracked carrier? It's because they were of the opinion that this would be a far more useful vehicle to have for them in terms of range and what was actually currently then available. It could be built elsewhere and delivered in the same way as the South African reconnaissance car was using the Ford truck chassis with the Marmon Harrington front axle, allowing for obviously full four-wheel drive capability. The Indians were using the field artillery tractor, or what we would be calling the quad. And this is where the engine was reversed. Instead of being at the front, the engine was obviously put towards the back of the chassis, and that basically provided you with a solid platform upon which to build quite a big or heavy armored car. This is the first of two body and chassis combinations that we actually have for the New Zealand, let's say, attempt at the Indian pattern carrier. Now, what you'll notice from this is that somebody has attempted to cut this apart, or cut the armored body apart, and you can see what we will actually have to address here. Now, this is one half of it. Below we have a complete chassis, and then we have a complete front of this particular vehicle, but we're going to have to piece the rest of it together. This project itself, you can get excited at it, looking at it from different angles, just realizing how much there is, and until you actually walk around it and realize how much less there is than what you originally thought. But given the rarity of the vehicle, this is still a very, very exciting project. The Tata Iron and Steel unit that was that was making the armored bodies and assembling these Indian pattern carriers was actually based at Jamshedpur. And interestingly enough, now obviously everybody knows about Tata Iron and Steel. People also know about Tata Motors recently, with obviously what happened with Jaguar Land Rover. But you talking about companies that actually still exist today, are much, much stronger today, but that were responsible, for example, in India's case, to actually putting these together.
These armies that in the colonies were sitting there completely under-equipped, and Japan was on the warpath, and they wanted to equip the armies as quick as possible to deal with any onslaught that would come from the east. The Indians were producing their carriers from 1941 onwards, but they needed to increase the production of these, and they made contact with the New Zealanders with a view to New Zealand assembling carriers for them from knockdown kits. So it was an idea originally to extend the production of Indian carriers to get as many of them produced as quickly as possible.
And the blueprints which you've seen were the original blueprints that were actually provided by India to New Zealand of the armored hull, correct?
Yes, the Indians obviously provided detailed blueprints. The New Zealanders then redrew those because they were essentially putting the Mark II type Indian armored body onto a chassis that would have been somewhat later in the Indian production, the Ford 191 chassis.
Do you see the Indian efforts insofar as what they put together initially? Do you see them, the Mark, let's say, 2 to Mark 2A, 2B, 2C, as being really different? Or what actually do you think drove the differences in these armored body designs?
As far as I understand it, the bulk of the carriers were really the Mark IIs in various versions of the Mark II. I think the biggest number was probably the Mark IIAs, where they were open-top carriers, but wheeled compared to Brengan carriers, which were tracked. And it was later on they became gradually more specialized. They put roof armor on, then they put a small turret on, then they put a larger turret on, each one making a slightly different configuration. And then much later on in 42, 43, they produced the Mark IV, which effectively was a redesigned armor with the driver in a small armored section down at the front, and the much lower arrangement.
What's your opinion then as to why things went wrong then with the Indian pattern carrier assembled in New Zealand? What went wrong with this process?
Because of the delays, things are moving ahead, and obviously Ford have been perfecting their chassis. The New Zealanders, because they're taking time to do the work, have designed it for the original pattern of right-hand drive, copied from the original, basically Mark II Indian pattern carriers. But then when the chassis finally arrive at the end of 1942, beginning of 1943, straight away there's a problem. The bodies have been designed for a right-hand drive position at a much higher location in the chassis, and the wheel wells for the front have had to be cut out in the armor plate and raised, and an extension added in. But also the problem is the driver is in a different location. Now, there's no obvious problem on the New Zealand ones that we see in terms of the front plate being modified, but personally, I'm convinced that they had to take off the front plates, throw them away, or use them, cut them up in pieces to make the wheel wells bigger, and put on brand new ones to cater for the fact that the driver was way down in a lower position. But if you look at our ones, you'll see where the top of the wheel well has been cut out, the armor plate has been cut, and a new piece has been welded in from. You can see it on the inside of the vehicle. The other one is a one-piece wheel well, so it strikes me that that's a later production.
So I wonder which one we should use.
Well, the most of them I'm noticing are on the earlier ones, let's say, where they've had to be modified.
All right, sir. So we'll go and have a look at that vehicle down the bottom there, and I will give you a call later. But thank you very much.
Talk to you then. Okay, bye.
This vehicle we're looking at now is the second of the Indian pattern wheel carriers. And this big armored section on top here is actually the lower half, or half of the front of the vehicle we were looking at previously. This chassis here is largely complete, and we have the majority of the rest of the components, and this body itself will provide, I think, the basis for us to actually work from here. Just to track back to the part of the discussion that we were having earlier, in which Hilary was talking about the wheel arch being added to account for the increased size of the chassis. This is in the C291, as opposed to the earlier 1941 chassis that had actually been the basis for this particular body here. You can see where they actually cut the wheel arch out and made it higher. And that's the same on the other side. And as Hilary said, later examples didn't have that work done, and the one that we were looking at the first time around doesn't actually have that done to it. So this would represent an earlier armoured hull construction than that one over there. The Empire Collection is important to us as an organisation because it fills gaps in the national collection. It addresses the conventional understanding of what made up the British Army. The story of those countries' contribution to the war needs to be split away from the British Army and understood for the countries that they represented. And that's what we hope to do.